I'm just ready and excited to jump in to this series with you as we look at one of the most controversial stories in the scriptures, one of the most hotly debated stories in the scriptures, the story of Jonah. And I love the story of Jonah because in many ways, as we unpack this story over the next 4 weeks, what we'll find is that the story of Jonah is a lot like our story, that in the midst of this ancient text and historical account, we find ourselves firmly fixed in that place. And I think in many ways, we'll be able to resonate with the emotions and the things that Jonah felt as he interacted with the mystery of God. Because at some point in our life, we've probably experienced this. Let me ask you this question. Has God ever acted in a way that seemed strange or out of character to you? Have you ever been there before? Maybe it's in a way that you just see the world, or maybe it's how it seems like God is interacting with you, or maybe you're not sure what you believe about faith, but you hear about stories about God and what he would do and how he seems to act, and you would say, if I were God, I would definitely not do it that way. That does not make sense to me. Or maybe it's not so much what you see in the world, but it's when you've been reading through, the Bible, and maybe you've come to a complicated part and thought, what in the world is going on here? This seems so counterintuitive. Maybe you're like me, and back in my adolescent days and kind of even early into college in my early 20s, I would do this thing, especially when I was stressed out, especially when I felt a little bit anxious, especially when I kind of came to the end of my rope, that I would take my Bible, I'd place it firmly on, the counter, and I'd say, Lord, speak to me, and I would just let my hands go, right? And whatever the verse landed on, I would hope that there was something good there, and that usually landed on Lamentations, and I just started to cry because I didn't know what was going on, so I'd close it again. I'd say, Lord, speak to me, and then I'd get to Leviticus, and that was super confusing, then kind of weird, so then I'd close it again, and then I'd kind of scroll over to the New Testament, and then I'd open it up and hopefully land on something good, right? Like that kind of deal. Maybe you've experienced this tension that God acts in a way that you didn't expect him to act, or God seems to do something that you didn't expect him to do. And that is the story of Jonah. That is what Jonah experienced in his life. In fact, as we read through the story of Jonah over the next 4 weeks, we're just going to take it verse by verse. This is what we find, is that Jonah is a not so feel-good, too close to home story of our rebellion and God's loving pursuit. Like this story doesn't end like all with a living happily ever after kind of finish. It is real, it is raw. It's like your favorite television show that got canceled before they came to resolution. Like that's the story of Jonah. And so what we're going to do over the next couple of weeks is we're going to enter into a very real and raw, not too feel good kind of story that in so many ways is a reflection of the same frustrations we have with God, and maybe part of the reason why we've walked away from God in the first place. And it starts in Jonah chapter 1, verse 1. This account that was written sometime in the 8th century by Jonah himself, recounting his life and his story. And it picks up in this way in verse 1, that the Lord gave this message to Jonah, son of Amittai. Now we got to stop here a minute just to understand who in the world Jonah is. Because the book of Jonah is not an allegory, it's not a parable, it's not a fictional account. And we know this because it's not written that way. Jonah was a historical figure, and we know that because in 2 Kings, which is a historical document that really covers the rise and fall of the empires of Israel, Jonah is found in that story in 2 Kings 14. In fact, he's a part of the rise of the Jewish empire and the empire of Israel, and he's a significant part of it. If you were writing an allegory or a fable or a story, you would do it by saying something along the lines of once upon a time, or you would use characters that were not real, that could not be historically verifiable. Jonah's a real guy who lived a real life, who experienced some real things. He's a historical figure. He's a well-regarded religious leader. You got to know this about Jonah, is that Jonah was a prophet, and there are times where he was used by God prior to this experience to do significant things. Everybody who read this story, everybody who heard this story growing up, they knew who Jonah was. And because it's written like a history, not a parable, we'll have to wrestle down some of the supernatural things that happen along the story. But what we'll find as the weeks go by is that these supernatural things are actually not as inconceivable as maybe we would think them to be. Verse 2 says this, that Jonah gets a message from God, and God says this to Jonah. He says, "Get up and go to the great city of Nineveh. Announce my judgment against it, because I've seen how wicked its people are." Now, Jonah hears this message, and he didn't need God to tell him that Nineveh was a wicked place. Nineveh was the seat of the Assyrian Empire. And if you were to think about some of the most horrific, gory scenes that you have seen in a movie talking about war, Assyria would see that and then raise you double, all right? Assyria was one of the most wicked empires that have ever existed in human history. And Nineveh was the city seat. It was one of the largest, most powerful cities in the empire. About 50 years later, the capital city of Assyria would be in Nineveh. This place was so large and so massive. It had incredible art, incredible culture, incredible food, and it was also incredibly violent. In fact, you can go to see the ruins of Nineveh today in a city called Mosul. It's modern-day Mosul in Iraq. And the people of Assyria were known for their horrific activity towards the people that they conquered. In fact, it was not uncommon for people to walk towards a city and see a mound of skulls that were an indicator that the Assyrians had come to conquer that place. They were so violent and ruthless that they literally flayed. They would skin their captives alive, hang them out to dry, and use them as celebratory rugs. I mean, these people were horrific. They would carry people and literally put a stake through their tongue as they sat on the ground. This was the work of the people of Assyria. And God invites Jonah to go to the center of that place. Nineveh, part of the Assyrian Empire. Nineveh, the large urban center. Nineveh, known for its violence and art. We've got an image of the city gates of Nineveh here, a rendering of that. You can go see ruins today in Mosul. A place so large that a chariot could turn a full circle on the top of its walls. I mean, an incredibly powerful place. For God to tell Jonah to go to Nineveh would be tantamount to a Jewish rabbi standing up in 1940s Germany declaring that what the Nazi party was doing was wrong. It seemed like a death sentence to Jonah because the people of Israel were not foreign to the work of the Assyrian Empire. They had experienced the sacking of their cities. They had experienced the worst of the worst. Jonah did not like Nineveh. He did not like the Assyrians. They were the sworn enemy of Israel. And God tells him, I want you to go there, set up shop, bring a megaphone, plant a church, and start telling people about me. So let's not be too tough on Jonah when he makes some decisions today that we think are not the best decisions. Because let's be honest, what would you do? What would you do if you were in Jonah's shoes? I know this, that God has asked me to do far less, and I have said no. God has asked me to do far less with far less of a cost, and I have said that must be a pass. God has asked me to do things before in my life, and I've thought that must be the bad tofu I ate last night, but let's be honest, I never eat tofu because I love God, right? Like that, let's just be real. But here's what I know. If you follow Jesus, there will be times in life when following Jesus will make no sense at all. And if you've been a follower of Jesus for a couple of months or you've been a follower of Jesus for years, you know this to be true, right? Now, there's going to be something you read in the text that seems impossible to do. That you're going to be praying and you're going to hear something and it's going to seem impossible to do. What would you do if you were in Jonah's shoes? Well, we know what Jonah did. In verse 3, Jonah got up and he went, I love this, in the opposite direction to get away from the Lord. So Nineveh is northwest, and Jonah heads southeast. He went down to the port of Joppa, where he found a ship leaving for Tarshish. Tarshish was 1,500 miles the opposite direction of Nineveh, all right? He went as far away as he could. He bought a ticket and went on board. He literally hopped on Carnival Cruise Lines, got a good deal at the end, and he went to southern Spain, that's where Tarshish is, for a vacation, hoping to escape from the Lord by sailing to Tarshish. And right here, we find common ground with Jonah, don't we? Because there have been times in my life, and I'm sure there's been times in your life when God has asked you to do something, a small thing or a big thing, and you've thought, I'm going the direct opposite direction of that. We have three responses when God calls us to do something. Rebellious running, which we see Jonah do in chapter 1. Rebellion is simply this. When God says go, rebellion says no. It doesn't have to be something big. It could be something small. But in those small things, when God says go, rebellion, it happens when you and I say no. The second one is resentful obedience. We'll find Jonah do that in chapter 3. It's this version of, all right, fine, I'll do what you want me to do, but I'm not going to be happy about it, you know? It's basically my 9 and 7-year-old right now who are at an age in life where I can give them responsibility. Like they have some chores now that they need to do around the home. And they can do it with a happy attitude, right? Or they can do it with a bad attitude. And if you're a parent, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? My daughters, they have a bad attitude every single time I ask them to get me the remote while I'm in the living room. And I think it needs to stop because I am building their character. That's what I'm doing. But you know that, right? The resentful obedience. I don't want to do this, but I guess I'll do it, but I'm not going to be happy while I do it, and I'm going to let everybody know I'm not happy while I do it, right? It's going to happen this afternoon when you guys fight over who's doing dishes. And then the last one, the one that Jonah never gets to, the one that would be the way the story would end if it ended well, but it doesn't. Redemptive trust. When we look at God's character, we look at who he is, we look at what he's done, and we say, I don't know how this is going to work out. I don't know in what way this is going to make sense, but God, I trust you. You've been faithful in the past, and I know you'll be faithful now. But Jonah does what many of us do. I want you to see this about Jonah. It's not that Jonah was a guy who was far, far away from God. He was a guy who was really close to God. He was a prophet of God. He was used by God in significant ways. And this is super important for those of us who have been followers of God for a long, long time. This is not a story about somebody who runs away from God who wasn't close to God. This is a story about somebody who was close to God, who said no to God, and the result of that was significant cost. For some of us, the greatest mistake we can make, or the greatest tragedy of our life, is to be close to God and be in proximity to him, but yet never fully surrender to him in every aspect of our way. And Jonah did that. Because when God didn't do what Jonah expected God to do, Jonah walked away. And if we're honest, this is all of our temptation, isn't it? That when God does stuff according to our plan, it's easy to say, I'll follow you. When God asks us to do things that seem to work out for our benefit, sure, God, I'll do that. But it's the stuff that seems like sacrifice. It's the stuff that bends on our time and our treasure, that those are the things that we say no to God with. And when we say no, I just need you to hear this, that we're rebelling. Because God is not our co-pilot. God is not somebody who comes alongside as our assistant. God is not a supernatural Siri who we get to lean on from time to time. God is the God of the universe. And any version of disobedience to the one who's created it all is rebellion. And there are costs to that. There are costs to that you and I are paying right now in our life, and you and I are paying because of other people's disobedience that we feel. Today, as we walk through this verse by verse, I just want to answer this one question. What happens? What happens when we say no, when God says to go? What happens when we say no, when God says to forgive? What happens when we say no, when God says to serve? What happens when we say no, when God says to love? What happens when we say no, when God says to admit that we're wrong? There are significant consequences. And the first one is this, is that life just gets harder when we rebel. Like some of y'all know this, right? Like this was like your college days, right? Like life gets harder when we rebel. And we find this in verse 4. But the Lord hurled a powerful wind over the sea, causing a violent storm that threatened to break the ship apart. So Jonah pays for his ticket in Joppa. He hops on the boat. He's sailing to Tarshish. He's gone up to the buffet. He's gotten his food at the cruise line. He's gotten, enough ice cream to make him happy. He's settled in, and they're going on their journey. And as they're going on the journey, there is a massive storm that begins to brew. And we know that this storm isn't an itty-bitty storm, but it's a supernatural kind of storm because it's one that makes the sailors nervous. The guys who do this every single day of their life, what they're experiencing with this storm, it is something way more massive than they've ever seen before. Tim Keller puts it this way in his book, The Prodigal Prophet, a great read if you're interested in studying more about the story of Jonah. He says this, that the Bible does not say that every difficulty is the result of sin. Meaning there are hard things that happen in our life, not because of a wrong thing that we've done or because of our disobedience, just because life is broken and life is hard. But, and I think this is so important, it does teach that every sin sin is rebellion. Every sin will bring you into difficulty. Every sin has a mighty storm attached to it. That when you and I say no, when God says go, there will be a storm that we invite into our life. That the response and the result of our rebellion to God is not calm seas, but added torment and tempest in our day-to-day experience. Proverbs 14:12, written by one of the greatest, wisest people of all time, says this, that there's a way that seems right to a man, meaning there's a way that you think life should go. There are intuitive decisions that you think should happen, but its way ends in death. And some of us are living proof of that, aren't we? Like we tried to do it our way instead of God's way, and that led to the death of a relationship. We tried to do it our way instead of God's way, and that led to the death of our finances. We are in a financial storm right now, and the reason why we can't get out of it is because we have not yet submitted to God's way of stewardship. For some of us, it's the death of our own soul and our own joy because we're not choosing God's way, but we're choosing some other way. And every single time you and I rebel, we invite a storm into our life that is the natural consequence of our decisions. Which begs this question. What self-inflicted storms are a result of our rebellion? Like maybe the financial mess that you're in right now is because of your rebellion. And it might not seem like a big thing to you. It might seem like a small thing, but small things cause big storms. Small rebellion causes big storms. Or maybe it's relationally. Like you know that God says that you need to forgive that person, but it feels so much better to harbor bitterness and anger and work out in your mind the internal conversations that you're going to have, or to Facebook stalk them on Facebook and hope that their life comes crashing down, and you don't realize that what you're doing is inviting a storm of bitterness and pessimism into your own life, and you're ruining your ability to interact with others. What self-inflicted storms are you experiencing right now that are a result of your rebellion? Here's the second one. When we rebel, others pay the price. You know, one of the lies that we can believe is that my relationship with God is private. And the reality is that while it is personal, it isn't private. That every decision that we make, every no that we say to God has a consequence that doesn't just impact us, but it impacts the people around us. And we find this in verse 5. Fearing for their lives, the desperate sailors shouted to their gods for help and threw the cargo overboard to lighten the ship. So this is a massive storm. This is the kind of storm that makes the sailors freak out, all right? These guys are not like deeply religious people, but it's so bad they're calling out to all of their gods, all right? I mean, it is literally like a come one, come all buffet of gods. They're trying all of them. It's a shotgun approach. Everybody pray to every god that you know, every god that your grandmama knew about. Just make stuff up, pray to pretend gods, and let's hope one of them hears us, because if not, we are in trouble. And you would expect Jonah, the prophet of God, right, to be up there praying with them too, right? Except he's not. Look where he is in verse 6. So the captain went down after Jonah and said, "How can you sleep at a time like this?" I mean, like some of y'all can nap at any place, right? I don't know if you can nap through a storm like that. He is knocked out asleep, he shouted. "Get up and pray to your God. Maybe he will pay attention to us and spare our lives." Now, an important comment here to make that I think is so interesting is that the Hebrew word down is used multiple times in the story of Jonah. And the idea is that he went down to Joppa, he went down to the boat, he went down into the hull of the boat, he went down to Tarshish. And every time you see the word down, it's a poetic image that the writer is using to show a descent of soul and spirit. Jonah isn't taking a nap because he's in a cruise ship coma, all right? He's taking a nap because it's the kind of sleep you take when you just want to get away from life and get away from the world. And he's disconnected, and he's disenchanted, and he's disengaged, and he's lost hope. And all of these guys are freaking out because of this massive storm that's coming because of one guy's disobedience. And you need to hear me. When you and I say no to God, the collateral damage isn't just our life, it's the life of the people around us as well. Because we're all in the same boat. And you know this. You know this because some of our parents, right? said no when God said go, and we felt the weight of their broken marriage and relationship, and we're still picking up the pieces. And some of us know that because of our own personal life. Some of the people we've loved the most, we've lost because of our own choice to go our way instead of God's way. So hear me, others pay the price in our disobedience and our disengagement. It is Jonah's disobedience that led to the storm that affected everyone, but pay attention here. It's also Jonah's disengagement while he's in the storm that prohibited the solution. Because the God who brought the storm is the God who Jonah knows. And the only one who knows that God on the boat is Jonah. And his unwillingness to engage with them is what's keeping the storm coming. Jacques Ellul writes it this way. He says, these Joppa sailors are in modern terms non-Christians. But the lot of non-Christians and Christians is linked. They are in the same boat. We're in the same boat, y'all. The safety of all depends on what each does. They are in the same storm, subject to the same peril, and they all want the same outcome. I think this is so massive for us to get. That Christianity is not an invitation to step out of culture. It's actually an invitation to engage culture and bring the best of what we have. That our community will only flourish when we're engaged in our community. That our cities will only look better when we do everything we can to bring added value to our community. And unfortunately, some of the teaching that we grew up with as it pertains to church was the direct opposite of that, wasn't it? It was like only listen to Christian music, right? Which is usually terrible. Only watch Christian movies, which are always terrible, right? Only eat Christian food, which is okay with me because it includes Chick-fil-A, right? But that is the journey of our life and story. And what we find here is, as our public schools go, we go. As our health system goes, we go. As our environment goes, we go. And God has invited us, Nona Church, to be for Nona. That's why we talk about being engaged in our community. That's why we're going to go be church on July 7th serving nonprofits. Not because it's a cute thing to do, but because it's how we bring added value to our community. It's the invitation of all of us. And when you and I run from God, when we say no, it's not just us who lose out, but it's the people who we love the most because we're all in the same boat. So let me ask you this question. Your choice to say no to God's way relationally. Your choice to say no to God's way when it comes to generosity. Your choice to say no to God's way when it comes to forgiveness and obedience. What's at stake if we continue to say no to God? What was at stake if Jonah didn't get pulled by the collar by the captain and say, hey, we need you, come be a part of the solution? When we rebel, we also lose our way. The following interaction that Jonah has with the crew members, I think is such an interesting one because I think it's real life. I would love to do a personality assessment on Jonah, but I won't do it today. Verse 7 says this, then the crew cast lots to see which of them had offended the gods and caused the terrible storm. So they go to the cruise ship casino and they begin to play Russian roulette. And when they did this, the lots identified Jonah as the culprit. The number keeps on dropping on Jonah. It is definitely Jonah's fault. No one is convinced otherwise. It is this prodigal prophet. It is Jonah's fault. We are in this mess. So then they look to him, right? Imagine all of these sailors looking at you, saying, why has this awful storm come down on us? They demanded. And then they ask some really important questions here. Who are you? It's a question of identity. What is your line of work? What country are you from? And what is your nationality? They essentially ask the first three questions you ask whenever you meet somebody on a Sunday morning or you go out to lunch with a new friend or go back to freshman year of college. These are basically the questions, right? What do you do? What is your major? Where are you from? And what is your background? What's your ethnicity? These are the questions. And they're asking him these questions because they're trying to understand Jonah's identity. Who does Jonah believe himself to be? And what we find in verse 9 is that Jonah answers in a way that points to his brokenness in the moment. That when you and I run from God, we drift from who God actually says we are and we miss out on our identity. Jonah appeals to his patriotism and to his heritage before he appeals to his God. He actually flips the questions that they ask and he reverses them in order, prioritizing the least important thing as the most important. And he says, I am a Hebrew. and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land." The sailors were terrified when they heard this, for he had already told them he was running away from the Lord. And I love how they said this. "Oh, why did you do it?" they groaned. Like, come on, man. He made the sea and the land. That's a merism, meaning Jonah's using two words to explain a totality here, saying, I worship the God who's in control of it all. He's the one who's causing the storm. It's 100% my fault. I ran away from God, and now we find ourselves on this boat, and they're sitting there thinking, could you have picked a different boat? And since the storm was getting worse all the time, they asked him, what should we do to you to stop this storm? And Jonah gives the most pitiful response. He says, throw me into the sea. He throws a big pity party. And it will be calm again. I know that this terrible storm is all my fault. Instead, the sailors rowed even harder to get the ship to land, but the stormy sea was too violent for them and they couldn't make it. So that's ironic, right? It's like, okay, it's clearly this guy's fault. The creator of the universe has moved everything to create this storm, but if we try really, really, really hard, we'll get there by ourselves. Nope, doesn't work. I want you to think about the trajectory of Jonah, okay? Jonah, the prophet of God, who in 2 Kings chapter 14 is one of the primary leaders and voices during the rise of the empire of Israel. I mean, everybody knows him. Like, wherever Jonah goes, he gets a drink for free. Whenever Jonah goes to play golf, he gets the pastor's discount. All right, I mean, Jonah's got a good life. He's well known, he's well respected, and he's close to the creator of the universe. And God asks him to do one thing, and he says no. And the result of that is Jonah ends up no longer identifying primarily as a son of the Most High God, but identifying himself by something else. For him, it was his ethnicity. For us, it's our job. For us, it's our 401k. For us, it's just how successful we are or how good our kids are doing or whether or not they made the best team in the club. And we begin to identify ourselves by all of these things that are secondary, not primary. And he eventually gets to a point so low in his life because of his rebellion. He's lost his way so much that he would say, it'd be better that I just die. Isn't it amazing how fast we can drift from who God says we are when we say no to what God asks us to do? Let me ask you this question. What if the reason you feel lost is because you've been running from God? Maybe the reason why you're struggling so much with whether or not you get the promotion or not, and you're getting anxiety over that, is because you're running from God and not finding your identity in who he says you are. Maybe the reason why you are overly anxious about whether or not your kid makes that team has less to do with your pure love for your kid and more to do with the fact that if they don't make that team, if they don't get that grade, if they aren't a part of that group, it's going to feel like a poor reflection on your parenting and you're going to feel like a failure. Instead of receiving the grace of God who says, you don't need to worry about that anymore because I fully approve of you. What if the reason you feel lost is because you've been running from God? Because our small no's create big storms and bigger identity crises. But there's some good news. There's some good news in the midst of all of this. Because you and I have stories, don't we, of times when we said no, when God said go, and we saw the collateral damage of that. We don't have to go back in our history too far to remember those moments. Maybe some of us are living in those storms right now. And there's good news for us. There's like a silver lining in the midst of the storm. Do you see what I did there? When we rebel, God is still at work. Like we are not so important that we can ruin God's plans. But we are not so insignificant that God will not pursue us with everything that he's got. Jonah 1:14, then they cried out to the Lord, Jonah's God. The sailors who did not believe are the ones who begin to believe. Oh Lord, they pleaded, don't make us die for this man's sin, and don't hold us responsible for his death. Oh Lord, you have sent this storm upon him for your own good reasons. I mean, it's amazing how a crisis makes everybody pray, right? Then the sailors picked Jonah up, and they threw him into the raging sea, and the storm stopped at once. And the sailors were awestruck by the Lord's great power, and they offered him a sacrifice and vowed to serve him. In the midst of Jonah's running and rebellion, God utilized his mistakes and his poor decisions to win over the sailors who did not know God. Because no matter how hard you run away from God, God runs harder after you. That there's no rebellion too great in our life that God cannot restore or redeem for his purposes. But the question is, what did Jonah miss out on? You know, I find it interesting, if you go and look at the original kind of Hebrew rendering of this story, it ends at verse 16. Your Bible ends it at verse 17, but it ends at verse 16. Because as this story would have been told to the audience originally hearing it, when they throw Jonah into the water, Jonah is supposed to sit there and drift for a while. The image is not that Jonah lands in the water and then a miraculous thing happens that rescues him. No, Jonah is sitting there in the water with some time to think. The boat is beginning to sail away. The current is beginning to pull him away from land, and Jonah is by himself with no rescue in sight. And it begs this question. While there was a rescue coming for Jonah, Jonah didn't know that the rescue was coming. And maybe you feel that way today. And if you do, I want to ask you this question. Where have you said no where God has said go? Because your rescue might be found in your repentance. The word repent literally just means this: to turn away. So if God says go that way, and we say, no, I'm going this way, maybe our rescue, in fact, not maybe, I know our rescue is when we turn his way. And it could be a small thing. It could be relational. It could be a principle. It could be a generosity thing. But our small no's create big storms that have big collateral damage, that create bigger identity crises for us. And like Jonah in the midst of the sea with no rescuer in sight, maybe that's the way we feel. But there's good news. There's good news because, as we'll find out next week, there is a rescuer that comes for Jonah. That while Jonah was running, God was running harder after him. And the good news is that Jesus, our great rescuer, did everything right that Jonah did wrong. When Jonah ran away, Jesus chose to come near to us. When Jonah wanted revenge against Assyria and the Ninevites for all of the wrong that they had done to his people, Jesus came for rescue. And that's good news for me. And that's good news for you. Because I bring a lot of storms into my life because I say no when God says go. And there's a lot of collateral damage that I've caused because of my no's that I don't think in any way I'm ever going to be able to clean up. And the good news is that God works in the middle of the storms, and God brings rescue. And maybe today is the day we stop saying no, start saying yes, and find our rescuer. Would you stand with me as we pray?